Today we have a guest, Dr. Patricia Fox, who is going to help us undercomplicate the topic of financial psychology. So welcome to Undercomplicating Stuff, where we, two psychologists and coaches with over 40 years of combined experience, share our insights to help undercomplicate important topics. A friendly reminder that this video is meant for conversational and entertainment purposes only. Please see the information section of this video for additional resources. So I'm Dr. Julie Radico. I'm a psychologist, a coach, an author, and a speaker, and I'm here with Dr. Stacey Gedian.
Hi, I'm Stacey Gedian. I'm a health psychologist and the founder and CEO of a healthcare consulting and professional coaching business. And Dr. Fox, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate being here. I am Dr. Patricia Fox. I am a clinical psychologist in private practice where I see adults with some financial issues, but also with depression, anxiety, and relationship issues. I really appreciate you having me today.
We are so excited, and it seems like there's so many directions that this topic can go in. What is really meant by financial psychology?
Financial psychology is a very broad approach to both research and application of how we think about, how we perceive, what we believe, how we feel, and how we act around money. So financial psychology is informed by our cultural history, our childhood issues, the towns and the cities that we grow up in, the sort of messages that get communicated to us.
I imagine that this is a topic we could ask you questions about for days on end, because everybody listening to this has some relationship with money. And I'm mindful that you said a lot of how we interact with money comes from how we grew up and our experiences with money, like what we saw modeled in our parental figures and the experiences that you had, like if you were coming from a secure environment or not a secure environment, like how you feel like you might spend too much or not spend enough. One of the traps I think people talk about is that you should always have a balance on your credit card.
I would call that misinformation. And I think in the age of influencers, especially around financial psychology, it's a really dangerous trap to get into. I would say that if you're hearing that, that is something that you probably want to pursue a little bit more deeply. But those might also be beliefs that get passed down from parents to children or siblings to each other. As you already know, that in fact is not a good thing. You should be paying off your credit cards every month.
Have you seen a shift over the years with the proliferation of influencers and social media in terms of how it impacts people's relationship with money?
I would say that the biggest trap that people likely fall into is because there's so much more displays of wealth. It's easy to fall into this idea that we should have more than we actually do, or we should be striving to get more than what we actually have. And I also think the danger with influencers, and I'm also very hesitant about that word. There are many people that are out there providing really great financial education, and we might call them influencers, but they're not actually trying to sell you stock tips or a course on how to get rich. So it is really tricky because there's a lot more misinformation out there and a lot more implications about what we should be doing versus what is actually sound financial advice.
So the virtual online world that we live in, where we're constantly being encouraged to compare ourselves to other people and do this, like fall into this unhelpful thinking trap of social comparison. Every influencer or person online who appears to be like dripping in wealth, or that you need to live up to that standard. You need to spend all of your money on things to show or give the impression that you're doing better than you are financially. Or the reality is that most people don't live in that affluent type of space, that people like. It's important for us to be budgeting and thinking clearly about the financial decisions that we're making and how those are going to impact our savings and our retirement. I wonder what you might encourage somebody who you see who's coming in and feeling like they have to be spending more than they are bringing in, because otherwise people aren't going to look at them in a good enough way. Like if that's sort of how they've wrapped up their worth, is like their self-worth is wrapped up in their financial worth. Might you have conversations with them about that?
You can only use what you have. You have to think about what your education and your career path looks like and the amount of money that you can earn. But the reality is when people step into that, it's likely that they've had some experience in childhood that would suggest that if you have any value, you have to have material goods. And so that kind of an upbringing or that sort of childhood history is going to predispose a person to be influenced by those social media accounts. And so I would really be starting in childhood. What were the messages that your parents conveyed to you? What was the wealth of the town or the geography that you grew up in? What did your friends at school talk about? How did that come into play? It's a lot more challenging now because of our capacity to see what others have, where 50 years ago, it was just what was your next door neighbor or in your school or in your church or in your community. And so really being able to understand the messages that got conveyed to you either explicitly or implicitly and how they shaped your beliefs about wealth and earning money.
When you were talking about the differences between now and 50 years ago, it made me think of how my generation, you didn't talk about salary, you didn't talk about money. That was taboo. Whereas younger generations are very comfortable talking and sharing. And that to me is always a little bit jarring. That's a difference I know that I've had to get used to. You're mentioning how much impact someone's environment, development, upbringing have on their relationship with money. And then you put a couple of people together in a relationship or a friendship or another type of setting. And I'm wondering if you could share what might be some common issues that people come to you for when they are not having the same viewpoint on money.
Most of us don't think of money as part of our overall mental health and well-being. We tend to think of it as something that is over here. And so when we enter into a friendship or an intimate relationship, we're not really thinking about what differences in our money beliefs might come into play here. And so if I ruled the world, I would absolutely require people or pay for people as they're entering into an intimate relationship, for example, that they got to have half a dozen sessions of therapy that's centered on what are your values? What sort of money messages did you grow up with? How do you think about earning, saving, spending, and investing? We tend not to notice those differences until we're well into a relationship, an intimate relationship or a friendship. But when there are significant differences in the amount of money we have that's disposable for us, those are going to show up in all sorts of bumps. And most of us don't think about that. And most of us don't have a skill set to be able to talk about it. So for example, if I am the beneficiary of a trust fund and I have more than enough money to go to Paris for the weekend, and my friends are mostly, maybe they're just starting out in their careers, they're not making a lot of money. And I say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we went to Paris for the weekend? I know this really great restaurant. Most of my friends aren't going to be able to hop on a plane at last minute's notice and fly to Paris in order to go to a really nice restaurant. And so there's immediately going to be a discomfort, jealousy, envy. It may end the relationship. And so it's super important to be able to understand those differences. And then what do I do with all of the feelings that come along with that?
This conversation is worth its weight in gold, pun intended. The importance of having conversations about your relationship to money, your financial status, and not that you're like showing up at your first date and being like, this is how much I make and this is how I do my savings. And that, like, if you're investing in a relationship, whether it's a friendship, romantic relationship, whatever it might be, and this person is somebody that you want to keep in your life in a thoughtful way, having thoughtful conversations in an open, kind, understanding manner about the realities of your financial views and your financial status, they're really important. I imagine in that scenario that you gave where a friend who isn't even thinking about that this could be an issue for their friends of going to Paris for the weekend, they weren't intending to be cruel. They weren't intending to make people feel bad. That's just the lens with which they're viewing the world. And they didn't realize that other people have other circumstances in their friend group, right? They're just thinking like, this is something that is fun and exciting, and I want to share it with the people that I care about. Really being thoughtful about how to have those conversations of, oh, this isn't the reality for everyone. What's a good like starting place, do you think, for these conversations?
Honestly, it depends on the nature of the relationship. I think it's always helpful to ask questions, not directly about money. That's what I hear you implying, like as in how much do you make or how much have you spent? But rather, if you had the freedom to do whatever you wanted on a given day, what would that look like? And sometimes that can give you an idea of what people value, but also how they think about spending money. Somebody might say to you, oh, the perfect day for me is hiking in the state park. Another person might say, well, I would rent a car and a driver, and I would have them take me to Manhattan and I would see a show. That also opens up the door to be able to say, that's really great. Is that something you've done before? Is that something you do regularly? And that's going to give you some idea of kind of where they are financially. If you know them now at that point well enough, then you can ask more questions like, what do you do for a living? Which is a common question for us to ask. But how do you feel like you're paid? Do you feel you're paid fairly in comparison to other people who are in that same line of work? That might be another way in. Or what do you value? The thing with money I always like to come back to is what is important to us, what we value often reflects how we're spending our money. And so that's also a soft place to start. What's the three top values for you? What is most important to you?
I really appreciate that you bring things back to values because that's so important. And Julie and I have talked about that in different ways on different videos. If you could share a little bit about what you've learned in your expertise and what you do.
People come to therapy. Sometimes it's specifically about financial issues, but that usually comes up at some later point in time. Folks don't recognize that your financial decisions really underpin your mental health, your physical health, your relationships. I like to create the space for them to have those conversations comfortably so they can kind of go out into the world and can continue to have them. I just said to someone recently that the person we choose to be in a long-term relationship with is one of the most important financial decisions that we'll make. Now, if somebody had said that to me when I was in my 20s or even my 30s, I would have said something like, oh, love conquers all, financial differences don't matter. But the reality is, if you fall in love with someone or decide to commit to someone who doesn't have the capacity to earn a living or who really likes to spend, that's going to impact you long term. Really being able to ask those questions and to know how that's important for you and how that connects with another person, I think is just key for many of us to success in life.
Dr. Fox, I think what you just said is so important. Recognizing the importance of people that we get into partnerships with in our lives, the fact that how they interact with money, how they save money, what their skills are with navigating financial situations, like all of that is something you can grow in and learn together. Sure. The willingness to do that and the willingness to be thoughtful is such an important part of making sure that your partner is aligned with you, because everybody wants to be able to retire and retire in a comfortable, safe way that you have some savings to do so. If you are in a relationship, and say you're in a really long-term relationship, and it is one in which you and your partner have decided that you will be the stay-home parent, or you will be the person who stays home, and they are the person who is working outside of the home, and maybe that relationship ends in divorce. And like, how might you encourage people to think about financial stability in the long run if they're taking themselves out of the job market?
That is such a good question. I've been a little unsettled by the trend that I'm seeing with women willingly giving up their financial lives or financial well-being to their husbands or partners. So some of the data tells us that if you can afford to be a stay-at-home parent, then you are probably at the upper income level. If you are at the lower income level, generally both people are working and sometimes multiple jobs. And so there's a degree of privilege. And I think despite higher education, you see people falling into these more traditional roles. So if that's the choice that you make as a couple, there are numerous factors there. Ideally, you should return to work as soon as you can. There should be some sort of income. If that is not the choice you make as a couple, then the working spouse should absolutely fund an IRA. So if divorce does happen, that person has a retirement account that is intact. Those are like the really big ones. The smaller piece, and I say this to couples, whether one is at home and working or if both are working, generally in a couple, there's one person who's either stronger at the financial management or prefers the financial management. And it's still incumbent upon the other partner to make sure they're asking questions. Ideally, you're having a monthly meeting or a weekly meeting. How are we doing with finances? What's the electric bill? Why did the mortgage change? What's daycare looking like? Why did it go up so much? I think so often we step into this, well, he's better or she's better. I'm just not going to worry about it. And that is just a massive mistake. It is your responsibility to be informed, and it's your partner's job to make sure that you are informed. So whatever that's going to look like, monthly meetings, dinners, I like money dates. I think that's a kind of a nice romantic spin on it. Make sure when your spouse says to you, please sign the tax return, that you look at the tax return. You know where the tax return is stored. I have seen situations where a spouse was being asked for a divorce and they had to find the tax return. It was under lock and key. They couldn't find the key in order to access the tax return. It can be so costly if a relationship ends in divorce. I just can't say enough how important it is to take responsibility, whether you're a man or a woman in the relationship. You both should know what's going on. You should both be committed to understanding that process. Really, yeah, I'm just really unsettled that I see that as a trend. It's such a privilege to get an education, to have a career path, to own a credit card as a woman, because once upon a time we couldn't do that. When women especially give up that right, they're really shortchanging themselves and their children, quite frankly, if they have children.
I think it's so important for everybody who is an adult in the house to have some sense of the finances, because what if your partner passes away suddenly? We don't want this to happen to anybody, but you hear of accidents happening. And if you have no idea what's going on, and say you are the spouse who is still alive and you are trying to care for your 5 children and you just don't have any sense of how the finances work in your house, like that makes a really awful situation even worse.
From a death perspective, too, like now we're talking the people that we would expect to die are baby boomers, right? Because I count myself among baby boomers as older people. Also think about the technological skill differences. So, for example, I'm primarily the financial manager in my household. I do all the things that I recommend. My husband and I have regular meetings. We talk about it. Sometimes it's a couple of times a week, depending on what's going on. Maybe it's once a month. It has become more pressing because we kept our finances separate for a very long time. We were both divorced and remarried. And so that was just, it made sense for us. And we just merged recently, and we still aren't completely merged. Now, I'm more technologically able than my husband. And so he has joked and said, if you have a stroke or you die, I'm kind of screwed because I don't know how to access our accounts. Now, we're working on that, but that's a real thing.
Such important things to talk about, of how different partners in relationships may approach or have different levels of understanding of the finances. Just a personal note, when my father was ill, my stepmother had no idea how to even work the ATM, and they fortunately had the opportunity for him to teach her. I just imagine there are a lot of people that don't know how to do those things, feel embarrassed, or again, they don't have the heads up that they're going to need to learn how to do it. Not to mention a lot of people that really get scammed with all the phone calls and online things and experience a lot of shame and then don't share it or get more help. Could you speak a little bit more about shame and the different difficult emotions that people can experience related to finance?
In general, shame gets attached to money because we're told what we should do and what we should know. And when we don't, there's just this sense of there's something wrong with me rather than I didn't learn how to do this thing. I think particularly today, companies, for-profits, even nonprofits, they have become so sophisticated at separating us from our money that things that used to be much easier around financial management have become so much more complicated. And so like the scamming in particular, I've been seeing increased education for older adults about the scams because we are less technologically aware. We don't have a sense of how much the world has changed. We're more exploitable. And so ideally, we're practicing prevention. So if you have parents who are my age and older, we talked a little bit earlier about how do you communicate about money? How do you talk about money? With parents, it's super important to start those conversations early and then have them often. And it's really helpful to come from a point of curiosity and kind of a checking in. And so being able to say, hey, how are things going? Oh, how about the school district increasing the school taxes? How are you handling that? Oh, I noticed that you've got a stack of mail here. Do you need some help going through it? One of the most helpful things you can do with specifically with the scamming or preventing the scam is saying to a parent, oh my gosh, mom, I have to tell you this story about my friend Stacy. This happened to her mom and dad. And I'm just wondering, have you ever gotten phone calls like that? Or did you ever have somebody show up at your door? Or did you ever get an email? This way, it's a lot easier to go first, oh, somebody else has had this issue. And two, okay, this is okay to talk about. So I was having this conversation with my 87-year-old mother last week. I was having lunch with her and my sister. Her phone just kept ringing and ringing and ringing. And I'm like, what's going on, Mom? She goes, oh, I don't know. I keep getting these phone calls. And we got rid of her landline maybe 6 months ago. And so all of her calls come to her cell phone. Ideally, she has them programmed in with a name, but she will still pick the phone up and say, oh, hello, how are you? And, she's being her friendly self and she's trying to be helpful. This is how people get scammed. This is a conversation I had with her that day, but this is about the 50th or the 75th conversation. It's not that she doesn't understand or doesn't hear me, but she says, oh yeah, I know. I hung up on this person. I didn't take my time with this person. So I just keep trying to inform her about, oh, let me tell you about the most recent scam I heard about. These folks are so much more sophisticated. I don't think like a thief, but here's what I read. Ideally, it's prevention. But if they have been scammed, it's super important to be able to say, I'm so sorry this happened to you. It's not your fault. You had no way of knowing that these folks would do something like this. This happens to lots of people. Let's talk about what we can do so that doesn't happen again, because chances are good somebody will try to do that to you again. Banks have become a lot more proactive in helping reduce scams. And I have heard stories of bank tellers and assistant managers who actually intervened when an older adult came to the bank and said, I need to take $10,000 in cash out. And so they're doing a really nice job, I think, training people about how to manage scared or defensive or fearful adults. If you're hitting a roadblock with your family member, you might say to them, hey, what if you and I go to the bank and we just kind of do like a check-in on all your accounts and just make sure everything's okay? Then you get to lay eyes on who your parents are interacting with if they still go to the bank. And then you also get to express concern if you have those. So think of the bank as a partner in scam prevention with older adults.
Those negative emotions that come up about money when we make a mistake, we fall into a scam, we don't know how to check the ATM ourselves, we need our partner to show us, or we don't know how to log in, or we just make a bad financial decision at some point. All that shame that could come up is not fair for us to carry. And especially if you're getting scammed in some way, or your friend is very well intentioned, they're like, let's go to Paris. The fact that you feel shame about that is something that has been conditioned through the society that we live in for you to try to carry. Your worth is not dependent upon how much money is in your bank account. Your worth is you. Just the fact that you exist, recognizing how important it is for us to break the connection, that really tricky, sticky connection of feeling like our worth has to be tied to how much money we make. And this is one of the things that comes up often that I hear from people from other countries is they're like, oh, one of your first questions is, what do you do? What's your job? That's how you greet each other? And it's like, uh-huh. And they're like, that's not the norm in what we do. That's one of the things that could be of interest, but it's not the main thing. But that's what we do, right? We say, oh, what's your worth in how you are working? And that has a lot of negatives that can come along with it if we carry shame and guilt and blame of, well, maybe I'm out of work for a period of time or for an extended period of time, or I can't work for a multitude of reasons, that doesn't mean that you're any less worthy. So that would be my encouragement for people to take away from this conversation, because Dr. Fox, I think you brought up so many really important layers to this. And Stacey, I'm curious, like what would you encourage listeners to take away from our conversation today?
When establishing a life with a partner, discussing beliefs about money and the values about money is just as important as discussing career choices, where to live, whether or not to have children. And I like Dr. Fox's idea of really this should be something that should be part of when you're dating, when you're first getting involved with somebody, really learning and understanding, because this will impact your relationship forever.
The takeaway that I have, I'm reminded for myself again, but also because of this conversation, is that it's never too late to change your relationship with money. So no matter where you started, no matter where you came from, you can change what you believe about it, how you think about it, and how you interact with it. I think that ties together, points back to Dr. Radico's comment about shame. Putting it out in the open, having conversations about it, examining your own history, thinking about the conversations or the messages that got conveyed by family members. What is truth? What is perception? What is serving you? What is not serving you? You can start now. The advantage of living in the age of social media is that there's so much more good quality financial education out there. Stacey, to your point, one of my favorite podcasters is Farnoosh Torabi. And she often tells the story about when she started dating her husband as they were starting to get serious. She invited him on a money date, and they sat down, they went to a Mexican restaurant, had margaritas, and they talked about what was important to them, what were their financial goals, what would it look like if they became a partnership and they got married and they had children. And so she is really a big advocate of that. And she's a really great resource for women 30s and 40s, I would say. And so there's just so many opportunities to improve how we feel and interact with money. I think that's what I would like people to take away today.
We really appreciate you coming on to talk about this topic, Dr. Fox, because it is so layered and important. There's just so much. We could talk to you for like 7 more hours just on this. And so what I'm hoping is that for those who are listening, if this topic resonated with you, please share this video with somebody that you care about. You can also find resources about our discussion today in the description of this video. Also, please comment, like, and subscribe. You can listen to our podcast on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. You also can message us on any of our social media platforms with guests that you'd like us to have on in future episodes.